Dungeon Master Studios here, how y'all doing? So I'm sure as you guys know, I recently released my big review of part 1 of season 2 of Dragons Rising, and in that video I said that I will be releasing my ranking video of all the episodes in part 1 of season 2 of Dragons Rising, and this is that video. Now, ordinarily I would do this in the style of a tier list video, however, at the time of me making this video, I actually couldn't find a tier list that had all the episodes in it, so instead I'm going to be doing this in the style of a top 10 episodes where I rank every single episode in part 1 of season 2 of Dragons Rising. Now, before I begin, there are a couple of things that I want to say first. For starters, this video will contain spoilers for Season 2 of Dragons Rising, so please keep that in mind. Secondly, this list is just my own opinion, yours can be different, and that is totally fine. Feel free to leave your own personal list down below. And finally, the third and last thing, at the current time of me making this video, my channel has finally reached 400 subscribers on YouTube, and I could not thank you all enough for that, and I plan on making a special video for my 400 subscriber special. This is not that video, but I will be releasing one after I release this video, so keep an eye out for that. And so with all that out of the way, let's get into this whole thing. Number 10. The Blood Moon. This was the season premiere for the season, and in my opinion, this episode overall was kinda boring. Now, I do feel like this was a better season premiere in comparison to the Merge Part 1 for Season 1 of Dragons Rising, but still, I feel like this episode by and large wasn't very interesting, and I do feel like this episode was on the weaker side when it comes to Ninjago premieres that we've gotten. For starters, I wasn't really that interested in the stuff that was going on with Eren and Sora during the episode. I also feel like the social media stuff that we got at the beginning of the episode was kind of annoying. This episode was also the debut of Cinder, and like I said in my big video discussing Season 2 of Dragons Rising, Cinder is one of my least favorite characters when it comes to Ninjago. Plus, I feel like some of the action scenes during this episode weren't that interesting overall. However, there were some things about this episode that I did like. I enjoyed the stuff with Roz and Jordana. I thought that was kind of interesting. I also liked the stuff with Lloyd and seeing more stuff with his visions and the way that they were affecting him. I thought that was kind of interesting. And I do think that there were a couple of funny jokes in this episode, but by and large, again, I do feel like this episode overall was kind of boring. And again, I do feel like this is one of the weaker season premieres that we've gotten for Ninjago. Number 9. Shattered Dreams. The second episode of the season, in my opinion, was slightly better in comparison to the first episode, but by and large, I still feel like episode 2 was kinda boring when it came to the season. For starters, I feel like yet again, this episode wasn't very interesting overall, and there wasn't really that many things that happened during this episode that I was really that interested in when it came to the episode. There were a couple of things that I thought were interesting, like the big fight in the Cloud Kingdom. That was alright in my opinion, but I wasn't super invested in it. I also did like how this episode revealed some information about the Forbidden Five, and I feel like this episode did a decent job of setting that up for the rest of the season. I also feel like, yet again, there were a couple of jokes in this episode that worked, but overall, not really. I also did like the team's dynamic during this episode. I thought it was honestly good. But by and large, again, I just didn't really think that this episode was super interesting, all things considered. Also, there's one other thing about this episode that I do want to bring up, and this is something that I wanted to talk about during my big review, but I never got the chance to do that, so I'm going to talk about it here. In my opinion, Shatter Spin feels way too similar to Forbidden Spinjitzu, with both of these things being dark and corrupt forms of Spinjitzu that only Elemental Masters can use, and both these forms of Spinjitzu make the user more evil the more they use it, but it also makes the user stronger and gives them access to new abilities the more that they use it, and really the only difference is how the Elemental Master actually acquires the power. For Forbidden Spinjitzu, you need the scroll, meanwhile for Shatter Spin, you need a wolf mask as well as the mallet and gong of shattering. But really, outside of that, in my opinion, these two concepts felt way too similar to each other, which is something that honestly I didn't like that much. And so overall, when it comes to episode 2, again, this was another episode that I wasn't really the biggest fan of. Number 8. To Mysterium. Episode 6 of the season, in my opinion, was slightly better in comparison to the previous two episodes, but I still have a couple of issues with this episode. For starters, this was the episode where Dorama returned, and I thought that Dorama was boring and annoying during Season 1 of Dragons Rising, and I still thought that he was boring and annoying during this episode. Also, speaking of annoying, I feel like this episode and episode 7 are definitely where Eren is at his most unlikable when it comes to the season, and like I said during my review, I understand that this is meant to be intentional, and the idea is that Eren is supposed to be unlikable, so that way his bounce back will be all the more better. But personally, I still didn't like this because I just thought that Eren was really annoying during this episode, which is something that I wasn't really the biggest fan of. I also feel like the jokes in this episode didn't really land that well, but outside of that, I thought that the episode was honestly decent. I feel like the training scenes of the ninja trying to learn the Rising Dragon technique, I thought that they were decent overall, and I did like seeing Cole and Zane going up against Dorama's giant puppet. I thought that was also a good fight scene. Also, something that I want to say, I really like that all throughout Season 2, we see Kai, Cole, and Sora using the Chrono Steel mechs from the Elemental Mechs miniseries. Personally, I really liked those mechs, and I honestly think it's great that the ninja continued to use them during this season, and it wasn't a one-off thing that they only used in that miniseries. So again, I'm really glad that Season 2 brought this back, and again, overall when it comes to Episode 6, overall, I feel like this episode was decent. Number 7. Beyond the Phantasm Cave. This was the third episode of the season, and in my opinion, episode 3 was pretty solid when it came to the season. For starters, I really like the stuff that we got with Kai and Wildfire during this episode. I feel like the character work with these two was really good, and I feel like this episode did a pretty great job at showing us the father and daughter dynamic that these two have. I thought that was pretty good. I also really like the stuff that we got with Lloyd during this episode, with us seeing some more stuff with his visions and him being a conduit for the Source Dragons, as well as also his doubts revolving around him being a master. I thought that was honestly something pretty interesting. I also really like that one small scene that we got with him and Nia. I thought that was honestly a pretty solid scene. The ninja going through the trials, I thought those scenes were good, honestly. The fight against the giant tentacle monster was honestly pretty cool in my opinion, and I did also like the leap of faith scene. I thought that was solid. Although I will admit, I feel like the scene where the ninja saw their worst fears, I do feel like that was a bit too similar to Season 11, where we saw the exact same thing with the ninja seeing their worst fears. That's something I wasn't the biggest fan of, and honestly, I feel like Season 2 of Dragons Rising did end up taking a lot of things from Season 11, it's just something that I noticed. But overall, when it comes to this episode, like I said, I do feel like this was honestly a pretty solid episode for Season 2 of Dragons Rising. Number 6, Secrets of the Wildness. In my opinion, this was another pretty solid episode when it came to Season 2 of Dragons Rising. For starters, I really liked the big fight scene that we got against the agents of the administration. I thought it was honestly a pretty good scene, and I also liked seeing how the different characters fought against the agents, with Cole using his mech, Candelaria using magic, and Zane using tech. I thought that was honestly something pretty cool. When it came to these scenes with the rest of the ninja, I thought that they were solid overall, but nothing too interesting. There were a couple of things that I liked. For example, I feel like there were a couple of funny moments that we got with the ninja, but nothing super funny in my opinion. Also, when it comes to the scene with Ryu finally learning to fly, like I said during my big review of the season, I feel like the payoff for this was solid, but I feel like the show could have done a better job at building up to Ryu actually flying. But still, I feel like when it comes to this moment, it does work overall. But when it came to the stuff with the rest of the ninja, I wasn't particularly interested in it. The stuff with the villains, in my opinion, it was also solid when it came to the episode, but I don't have that much to say about it. Although there are a couple of negatives that I have when it comes to this episode. For starters, the Jay scene, in my opinion, felt pretty underwhelming and not very satisfying. I do like that we finally get some answers when it comes to the stuff with Jay, but this is basically all Jay gets for the entirety of Part 1, which is something that honestly I wasn't really the biggest fan of. Also, I feel like when it comes to this episode, it gives us a Zane fake-out death that can actually rival Crystallized for the worst Zane fake-out death of all time, because in this episode, Zane dies and then he's brought back almost immediately. And like I said, I genuinely feel like that can rival Crystallized for giving us the worst Zane fake out death of all time, which is something that I didn't like. But overall, when it comes to this episode, like I said, I thought it was solid. Number 5, Force from the East. This was the 4th episode of the season, and in my opinion, this was another pretty solid episode of the season. For starters, we get the chance to see Cole finally return, which I thought was honestly pretty great. Although I do wish the show would actually explain why Cole went back to the Land of Lost Things. I know that the magazines do give an explanation for this, but the show itself never does, and again, I do wish the show did give an explanation as to why Cole went back. Also, this episode is basically the closest that we ever get to Season 2 actually acknowledging what happened to Cole when he left the Land of Lost Things for the first time. Hopefully, Part 2 does give us a proper explanation as to what happened, because at this point, again, this episode is basically all we get. But still, I thought it was cool seeing Cole back, and I do feel like the scenes with him were honestly pretty solid, especially with him fighting against the Wolf Mask Warriors. Also, seeing the Finders fighting against the Wolf Mask Warriors, I honestly thought that the scene was pretty solid and kind of funny at times. I also thought it was great seeing them making their way to the monastery and seeing Cole and Zane reunite after all this time. That was something pretty cool. And I did like the scene of the ninja trying to open the big metal gate with them fighting against Egalt at the same time. I thought that scene was honestly pretty cool, and it was nice seeing the team dynamic. I thought it was honestly great. That being said, though, I do feel like the dialogue during this scene wasn't really the best, and I do feel like there were some dialogue moments that felt kind of on the nose, which is something that I wasn't the biggest fan of. But still, by and large, I do feel like the scene was honestly pretty good, and overall, like I said, I feel like this was another solid episode when it came to Season 2. Number 4, Forest of Spirits. The penultimate episode of the season, in my opinion, was another pretty solid one that we got. For starters, I feel like this episode gave us some pretty cool action scenes, like the scene with Kai, Sora, and Wildfire trying to make their way up the cliffs. I thought that scene was honestly pretty solid. Also, when it comes to Wildfire, I think it's really cool that in this episode we finally see Wildfire's leg being healed after all this time and her being able to properly do stuff again. That's something that I honestly liked. I really liked the scene of Roz fighting against Aaron. That scene, in my opinion, was really, really good, and I feel like this scene did a really great job of showing us just how evil and brutal Roz really is. That's something else that I really liked. The stuff with Cole, Zane, and Candelario was alright in my opinion. I will admit, I feel like not all of the jokes did land when it came to this scene, but when they did land, I feel like we got some genuinely good comedic moments when it came to the episode, which was pretty good. I also really liked seeing a lot of the stuff with the villains during this episode, seeing everything that Roz has done up to this point with him getting everything prepared for the Blood Moon ritual in order to bring back the Forbidden Five. That I thought was pretty good. And overall, when it comes to this episode, I honestly thought that it was good. Number 3, The Spell at the Waterfall. This was the 5th episode of the season, and in my opinion, this was a pretty good episode of the season. For starters, I really liked what this episode did with Bonzel, fleshing out her character more. With us learning that she's the physical embodiment of a magic spell, I honestly think that's a really interesting concept for a character when it comes to Ninjago. And I like that during this episode, Bonzel has a lot of doubts on whether or not people will actually accept her as a person, but we constantly see that people do accept her as a person, which is something that I honestly really liked. I also really enjoyed the flashback scene of her meeting Sensei Wu. I thought that was honestly a really great scene, and I just thought it was nice to see Sensei Wu back. That's something else that I thought was pretty good. I also really liked the stuff with the rest of the ninja during this episode, with them training under Egalt and Rontu. I thought that was honestly something pretty solid. I also really liked seeing the stuff with Egalt during this episode, seeing the beginning of his story that he would go through for the rest of the season. That's something else that I really liked. I thought that the action scenes during this episode were pretty good, and overall when it comes to this episode, like I said, I thought that this was honestly a pretty good episode of the show. Number 2, Fugitive from Madness. The 7th episode of the season, in my opinion, was one of the best episodes in Season 2 of Dragons Rising. I really liked this episode. For starters, I really liked the stuff with Egalt and Wildfire during this episode. I thought these two were honestly pretty good, and I feel like their dynamic honestly gave both these characters some really great character work and character development, which I thought was pretty solid. I really liked Lloyd during this episode, and I thought it was really cool seeing more stuff with Lloyd's visions, and I feel like Season 2 in general honestly did a pretty great job at handling stuff with Lloyd's visions, which is something that I liked. This episode was the debut of Candelaria, and honestly, I liked Candelaria when it came to Season 2, and I feel like her dynamic with Bonsall was honestly handled pretty well during the season. I really liked the stuff with Kai and Nia during this episode. I thought these two were honestly really great. I really enjoyed seeing these two training together. I really liked the flashback scene that we got with these two, and seeing Kai unlocking Rising Dragon technique for the first time, and seeing him being the first ninja to unlock the power, I thought that was honestly a really great scene. And finally, I honestly feel like this episode has the funniest animation error in all of Ninjago, and when it comes to that animation error, it happens right when Cole, Zane, and Bonsall show up at the Mysterium Monastery, and Cole says something, and it's so obvious that when it comes to the thing that Cole is saying, it does not match up with his mouth animation at all, and honestly, I thought that that was absolutely hilarious. And again, this is an episode that I really like. That being said, though, there are a couple things about this episode that hold it back for me. For starters, like I said, I thought that Eren was honestly pretty unlikable during this episode, so that's something that I didn't like. And also, this episode brings back the administration, and I really didn't like the administration during Season 1 of Dragon's Rising. I thought that the administration was really boring, and I thought that the administration was yet again really boring during this episode, as well as during Episode 8. So that's something that I didn't like, but other than those two things, once again, I thought that this episode was honestly great when it came to Season 2. Number 1, Rising Ninja. This was the finale for Part 1 of Season 2, and honestly, I thought that this episode was pretty great. For starters, the big fight scene at the Shadow Dojo Temple, I honestly thought it was really great, with us getting some really great action scenes during this episode, and the fight choreography was absolutely fantastic, and to me, I feel like this episode did a really great job at showcasing just how amazing WildBrain's animation is, mixed with the absolutely incredible visuals that we've been getting so far for Dragon's Rising. Honestly, it's something that I really liked. I also thought it was really cool seeing Lloyd and Nia unlocking the power of the Rising Dragon technique, and I especially like that when it comes to Lloyd, it's tied directly into his story arc that he had throughout Part 1. That's something else that I thought was pretty cool. I also really enjoyed seeing Roz during this episode, and we got a chance to see some more really great stuff from him during this episode, like him being the one to take control of Noct at the end of the episode, as well as this episode also setting up the Tournament of Sources with Roz talking to his master. I thought that was honestly pretty good. We also got Kai's sacrifice during this episode, which I feel was honestly handled pretty well, and I am interested in seeing what's going to be happening with Kai and Bonsall being trapped inside of Nether Space throughout Part 2. I'm honestly wondering where that's going to go. And also, when it comes to this episode, we had the moments with Eren attempting to use his object spin jutsu, but Sora ended up using her tech powers in order to make the mech hand spin around. And I am actually kind of interested in seeing where the story is going to end up going when it comes to Part 2 of Dragon's Rising. And I honestly feel like if this story is handled well, this could potentially change around my opinions on Eren and Sora. At this point, I feel like I've been kind of clear that personally, I haven't really been the biggest fans of Eren and Sora so far when it comes to Dragon's Rising. And I'm not saying it will happen, but again, if this story is handled well, then this could potentially change my opinions on these two characters going forward. Again, I'm not saying it will happen, but I'm saying it could happen, and it really all depends on how this plays out during Part 2 of Season 2. But overall, when it comes to Rising Ninja, I thought that this episode was honestly great, and I feel like it works really well as a conclusion for Part 1 of Season 2. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below, what do you guys think? Tell me, what are your guys' thoughts when it came to the episodes in Season 2 of Dragon's Rising, and how would you guys rank the episodes? Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.